last time we were together, we ended by talking about the problem of evil. This is a classical philosophical problem. Um, that's what it's called, right? This tension between um, the nature of God and the fact that there is suffering. So if God is all good and all powerful, then why would he allow us to suffer, right? And we said that the importance of this question is shown forth in what is at stake in this like tension or in this question, and that is um, doubting the nature of God. Sometimes those who suffer, or if we see the suffering of another, it can cause us to doubt the nature of God. So we can doubt that he's all good. So like, why would God, if he's good, allow this to happen? Or it could be doubting his all powerful nature, right? So, well, even if suffering does have to happen, then, or it does happen, then why wouldn't God take it away, right? So um, and this even can go so far in us and the persons who suffer as to even help make us begin to question the very existence of God. As a matter of fact, the article that I sent y'all that we'll be reading tonight together, C.S. Lewis, he was actually used to be an atheist, and he actually in the book, we're going to read an excerpt from the book, but in the book, the problem of pain, he actually talks about how this, for the non-believer, this is like a big deal, like, because they're like, well, there is a God, then how could he allow all this suffering in the world? So this question is a powerful question, and it speaks to the very depths of us and the very depths of our relationship with God. And so that's why it's an important question. And tonight we're going to look at some common theories offered. And I'm going to just pick up on the two most common like ones given in theology, at least right now. And you'll see that they're structured in a similar way. So first, there's an attempt, and these are the schools of thought we talked about last time, like there are differing schools of thought that attempt to answer this question of the problem of suffering or the problem of evil. And so the first thing that they tend to do is try to offer a definition of suffering and then give some possible reasons for the existence of evil and or suffering. And then usually, though, that's followed by a critique from differing schools of thought, right? So if you think of it kind of in terms of a conversation, right? So it's not definitive. So there's no, like, the church doesn't have well, the church does have an opinion that we're going to be going over teaching. We're going to go over tonight, but the church will give its teaching and opinion, but then like it kind of, sometimes the church, this is one clarification we need for tonight. Sometimes the church will like say the statement and say, hey, this is what we need to believe. And that's called the deposit of faith, right? So the deposit of faith is passed down to the magisterium and sacred scripture, and the magisterium's job is to protect that faith and pass it down to us. And so the church will, so like when I say the church, right, the magisterium will say, hey, this is what we need to believe to protect the faith and pass it along. But then other things it'll kind of leave open-ended and say, well, this is what we believe, and you're obligated to believe this to retain our faith, right? But these other things are kind of up for debate because we don't, you talk about it, theologians are going to argue about it, not argue, but like debate about it, and then you're going to propose it to us, and then we'll let you know, right? So that's kind of like how it happens. And so the fact that there is suffering, the fact that God has sovereignty over it, all the things that we saw revealed in Job, right? That God's not the source of evil, all of those things are like definitively held matters of faith, right? Now, if we want to talk about like other issues surrounding the issue of suffering and the nature of God and how that affects it, sometimes it's left open for theologians to kind of like explore and debate and then propose theories to the magisterium. So that's kind of like what these are, the schools of thought. That's what these are. So we're going to look at two of them, the two that tend to be kind of like the leading among theologians of offering a solution or reasons for evil in the world or suffering in the world. So the first is that we'll talk about is by St. Augustine. and the other one is by Saint Irenaeus. And even though Irenaeus in history comes first, we're going to talk about Augustine first, because he's the most widely accepted. At least part of it is the most widely accepted. And we're going to hear some passages from the Catechism tonight that echo at least a part of Augustine's theory. So Augustine's theory can be summarized in 4 basic principles. First of all, this theory defines evil as a privation or an absence of a good or a goodness that ought to be there. So evil is not simply just I did something bad, and so right, it's not associated necessarily. It is that plus, right? So in other words, evil is just the absence of good. It's just the absence. There's something good that should be there. It's not there. And so therefore, that's what we would call evil. And for Augustine's theory, the source of moral evil anyway, so like the evil that comes from like making bad decisions, so to speak, is because of our free will. That's where it comes from. That's what Bridget pointed us to last class, right? And the third part of Augustine's theory says that is called the principle of plenitude, right? So this is kind of like you have like part 1 of Augustine's theory, and this is kind of like part 2, principles 3 and 4. So principle 3 says, well, if you think about the best kind of universe there could possibly be, this is the kind of universe that God would want to have. And so since the best kind of universe would be the kind where there's every kind of existence that's possible, so that would be the best kind of universe. And so therefore, the most desirable universe would have to include evil, because the universe as a whole, to be the most desirable kind of universe, would have to include every kind of existence. And then that leads us to the 4th principle, called the theory of cosmic harmony. And this says that basically every reality and event has this beautiful resonating harmony. Think of a symphony. Like if you have just one instrument playing in a symphony, it's not a symphony, right? You need all of the instruments being played in tandem, right? So that they're beautiful and they're all putting their sounds together to create this beautiful harmony, this beautiful melody, so to speak. And so the theory of cosmic harmony basically says that all realities and events have this universal harmony, kind of like this balance, that when you put them together, they make this beautiful picture, right? Or this beautiful harmony. Even sin and punishment would be included in that. So you have like the goodness of grace, and but then you would need the counter of that, right? The opposite of that, the absence of grace, or evil, right, according to Augustine's theory, to be able to have this beautiful symphony in the universe, this perfect, most desirable universe. Now, this harmony, though, here's the problem, right? This harmony is only perceivable to God, right? So why there would be allowed this evil in the world to counter or to be on the opposite of this good, this particular good, or is only God can see like the whole picture. Only God can see the harmony that's created. We can't perceive it. Okay, so evil is the absence of a good that should be there. The source of moral evil is the free will of us, right? The most desirable universe is one where anything that can exist does. And the theory of cosmic harmony says that if everything, even evil, exists, then there's this beautiful universe that's created, that's this harmonious, beautiful place, but only God can see that harmony. So in a nutshell, Augustine's theory. Some of that might ring true for us and what we maybe know of church teaching so far. But I'm hoping that some of that also does not ring true, okay? Because we're going to see in a little bit that both of these theories are going to have things that you're like, oh, well, that could make sense. But then you're like, wait a minute, that doesn't. And I'll show you what I mean on the next slide. But first, let's talk about Irenaeus. So Irenaeus says, For Irenaeus' theory, this school of thought views the world as just a difficult environment, but this difficult environment that is the world is meant to be so that the soul can be purified. Evil is, for them, defined as the result of a weakness or immaturity. Now, not a weakness or immaturity like necessarily even not necessarily even sinfulness, just like kind of like an underdevelopment, right? Now evil is like can be sin, but it's plus, right? It's also could just simply be that, it's a lack of maturity in the world that kind of creates suffering, a lack of maturity in the person. And whenever you talk about persons, the soul, the person has to experience evil or suffering so that that person can mature out of their weakness and become the best potential self that they could be, right? And that there's no other way to achieve this in the person, that the person has to suffer to be able to become this best self, right? To become filled with grace. And in this theory, God is seen as being responsible for evil in the world because he has to put it here so that he can refine us, so that he can make us into the mature people that we're called to be, that he's calling us to be, right? So God is seen as being responsible for evil in the world, but his reason is because where evil exists, it'll produce a fully matured person in charity, which charity meaning like the fullness of the life of God within us, the fullness of the life of grace. Okay, so two theories, two different views of why evil could exist, and even definitions of evil, right? But these two theories also have some real weaknesses. And so we're going to look at those now, some critiques of these two theories from these schools of thought. So first up, Augustine's theory. So if you think about it, right, if the best kind of universe is one with all types of existence, including evil, then Christians would have to come to the defense of evil. We'd have to say, oh no, we want it. We want evil because if it doesn't exist, then we won't have our cosmic harmony, right? So without it, the creativity, the creative genius of God is jeopardized, right? So in the view of the cosmic harmony view, sin would be necessary for the perfection of the universe, right? Since it's beautifully counterposed to divine justice, right? So since it's like this beautiful opposite, right, that creates this symphony of perfection, then we'd have to actually come to its defense, which is, as we know as Christians, ridiculous, right? We would not defend evil. We're trying to get rid of it, right? In ourselves and in the world. That's our call. As a matter of fact, our baptismal call is to like rid ourselves and others, the world of evil. So it doesn't really add up. Some other things that don't really add up though. Do we really need evil or suffering to have a perfect universe? So if we think back to the creation story, right? God made this on the first day and this on the second day and this, right? And we go through the whole story. And at the end of each day, God said, and it was good, and it was good. You never hear God say, and now I'm going to put some evil over here, right? God, when the world was in its perfection, right? In the creation, right? God didn't need evil to make it good, right? He didn't need that. He doesn't need it, as a matter of fact, right? As a matter of fact, if you say that he did need it, then he can't be God. So there's a big problem there, right? So Augustine, that school of thought, unfortunately, has some serious problems, right? Some serious critiques. Okay, and then the critique of St. Irenaeus's theory, or the Irenaeus school of thought. So if the purpose of suffering is to make the person this perfection of grace, right? Then what about the person who has way too much suffering, right? What about the person who suffers excessively or repeatedly? I mean, how perfect do you need to be, right? How much suffering do you need to be subjected to be able to be this perfect picture of grace, right? There are people that get more than their fair share. There are also people that we see that kind of have a more easygoing time in life, right? And they have all their needs taken care of, and they have everything, right? And they don't seem to be suffering that much. So how do you explain like that they're not being perfected spiritually, right? So that doesn't make sense either. And then, of course, the biggest problem with Irenaeus' theory is that it is attributing the existence of evil to God, right? So if God is all good, he can't be also a little bit evil, right? He can't be the source of evil if he is all good, because then he would not be God. So again, Irenaeus' school of thought, though it might ring true, maybe is it possible that I suffer something and I become better for it and I become like more steeped in grace? Yeah, it's possible. Is that always the case? Does everyone who suffer always turn to become perfected in grace? No, they don't. So is it possible? Yes. But you see, in both these theories, there's something missing, right? And we're actually not going to get to like the real meat of what's missing until we start talking about John Paul II's letter, The Christian Meaning of Human Suffering, and that won't be until next week. But there's definitely something here. There's a missing step. There are maybe several missing steps in both of these theories. Okay, so we see that ultimately, even though maybe there's some good points here in these theories, that are at least these two most popular theories, we also see that they also have weaknesses that don't really match up to what Christians understand to be the nature of God. So that he's all good or all powerful, not are, and all powerful. So this is a problem. So before we jump in next week to John Paul II's missing steps, so to speak, or what else we need to understand about suffering to be able to live out of it or embrace it and live in it, because it's kind of our plight, right, as humans. We're gonna first go backwards a little bit to the book of Genesis, just a tiny bit though. And some clarification before we're going to jump into what we're going to talk about tonight. We have to understand that scripture is many books compiled, right? So it contains, it's not, we tend to see it as just one big book. But in reality, the Bible was many books, or many, in some cases, letters, like St. Paul's letters. They got passed around from Christian community to Christian community and read out loud, right? But the point is that it was not just one big book altogether, one big writing altogether, until much later than it was actually the words were written down, right? So it's many books actually compiled together. That's why we call them the books. A reading from the book of Job, a reading from the book of Genesis, right? We call them that because they are different books, right? Different writings. There's also many stories in the Bible, many different stories. And at the same time, one overarching story, the story of salvation, right? And God's work in time to bring about our salvation. But in that big story of salvation history is many stories put together in these various books. It also has many authors. Sometimes even one book of the Bible can have various authors. So that gets way confusing. We're not covering that in this class, but we also, with many authors, many stories, and many books all compiled, right, into one, there's also many literary genres. Okay, so there might be, for instance, there are songs. Why do we sing the Psalms at Mass? Because the Psalms were a book of hymns. They were sung. That's why we sing them. There are poems in the Bible. There are Proverbs. The book of Proverbs is a book of short sayings, of wisdom, right? So there are all these different types of writing. There's historical writing as well. So are there things in the Bible that actually happened in history? Of course there are, right? But is it a historical book? It's not a historical book in the sense that it's an exact account of history, but rather it has many types of writing. It has many genres of writing. But there is one important point about all these differences that the books have, and the stories have, and the authors, and the genres. There is only one truth, right? And whenever you look at the scripture as a book, it's really a book of faith, and it communicates to us truth. However the story's told, whoever wrote it, for whatever audience, right? The book tells us the truths of our faith. That's what it tells us. And so with this in mind, as we read some about this, the few excerpts that we're going to read from the book of Genesis tonight, we have to keep in mind that was the story of creation, is it an actual historical account? It could be, right? But the genre that it's written in is called myth. Now, it's very confusing to us to hear about myth, because whenever we think myth, we automatically think fiction. But that's not how myth was in the Old Testament and the time period when it was written. To write a myth didn't mean that you didn't write a true story. It meant that you told that true story in a particular way. And that's what's happening here. As a matter of fact, there's a lot of debate among scholars. This is one of those things that the church tells us that it can be debated. Like some scripture scholars will say, hey, there was an actual place, it was called Eden, there was a garden, here's where it was on the map, right? But then some scholars will say, no, it's completely mythological, there was no place, right? This is just a story of truths, right? But there's an important thing to say, because that's something that could be up for debate. But what's not up for debate about the story of Genesis is that Adam and Eve, or a man and a woman, were historical people that were creating God's image. They actually lived. They actually were made in God's image and had special gifts attached in the way that they were made to being made in his image. And they really sinned. And they really lost we call them the preternatural, or the above nature graces that they had as a result of God making them in his image. They really did fall, and we really did inherit the fallen state that they put us in. So that is true. And it doesn't change, right? It doesn't, no matter how the story's told, that is a truth of faith that we're obligated to believe as Catholics. And so we're going to look tonight, we're going to peek in to Genesis a little bit, because we have to understand the church's stance on where evil would come from. I think we have to understand something about how we're made in God's image. So in Genesis 1, verses 26 through 28, we have the creation story, right? And we have God speaking here, and it's the sixth day. He's made everything else, right? And here is his crowning glory of his creation. And he says, let us make human beings in our image, after our likeness. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, the birds of the air, the tame animals, all the wild animals, and all the creatures that crawl on the earth. So God created mankind in his image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. God blessed them, and God said to them, be fertile and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. So in this reading, we see some truths about the human being, right? They're made in God's image. They have dominion over the fish of the sea, right? They have dominion over the earth. What is dominion? Dominion means stewardship. It means that they're supposed to care for it. They're supposed to receive it from God and give it back to God as a gift, right? To offer it back to him. We see that something really important that's going to speak to what we're going to talk about tonight. Notice he says he made them male and female. And then he blessed them and said, be fertile and multiply and fill the earth, right? So here we see that God sets the human beings, male and female, into a covenantal relationship. Right? This is the first marriage, right? This is God putting them together and asking them to be fertile, right? And so he gives them dominion. He makes them a participant with himself, right? In the first paragraph, he gives them dominion over creation. And then in the second paragraph, he puts them in a covenant where they can participate with God as creators, right? It's beautiful. They're set into this covenant. But there's something not mentioned here that's important too, that we don't have time to like pull out the scripture for, so you'll have to take my word for it. But in the second creation story, which is found in Genesis 2, we can see that God puts man and woman into not only a covenant with each other, but into an exclusive, unrepeatable covenant with himself, right? So to be made in God's image means several things. It means that we have free will and we have intellect, which we can, so in other words, we can know ourselves. But it also means that I'm in a covenant before God, that I'm participating in the very life of God in the Trinity, right? So the Trinity is what we call a communion of persons. If you think about it, you have one God, but three persons. So what are they doing in there, right? What are those three persons doing? Those three persons in that one God, one essence, right? God isn't multiple gods, one God, but three persons. So the church calls us, they are a communion of persons or a communion of relations, right? So the Father is giving himself totally to the Son. The Son is receiving all that the Father is, right? Philip, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. Jesus said that, right? If you've seen me, you've seen the Father. So the Son receives all that the Father is and gives himself, right, back to the Father. And then this exchange between them, this love is so real, it is the Holy Spirit. It is the third person. So now we have the male and female who God calls and puts in covenant together to be fertile and multiply so that they can become a third, right? So this is part of their being in his image, right? Now, to be in this kind of covenantal relationship, it's really important because the next line after this, or a few lines down, I can't remember exactly, but, or I'm sorry, in the second story. In the second story, if we would read that one, it would also say, this is why a man leaves his father and mother and cleaves to his wife, right? So this is why, wait, I heard it, right? Whenever this covenantal relationship, right, there's a necessary element that we have to be in it. So when the Bible says, this is why the man leaves his father and mother and clings to his wife, and the two become one flesh. Notice the man leaves his father and mother and clings to his wife. So he makes a choice with his free will to cling to his wife, right? So we see that in this covenantal relationship, there has to be another element there, the element of free will. So to enter into covenant, right, I have to be free to love, right? So if I'm forced to love, it's not really love, right? So for covenant, free will is a necessity. So we might say, well, why did God give humans free will? You know, he could have just made us love him. Well, then it wouldn't, by definition, would not be love because I can't give myself in covenant, right? So in Genesis 2, we see kind of the essence of this gift of free will. We see when God, and what we're supposed to do with it, right? So free will is what enables us to be in covenant. We're in covenant with God and with one another because we're images of God. And now we're going to see, right, what we were expected to do with it once we got it, or at least with the original man and woman, we're supposed to do with it, right? So this comes from Genesis 2. I actually forgot to put the verses there, but I think it's 16. It starts in 16. The Lord God gave the man this order. You are free to eat from any of the trees of the garden, except the tree of knowledge of good and evil. From that tree you shall not eat. When you eat from it, you shall die. Now, all the time when I say, what's the commandment that, God's giving the people here, the first man, they always tell me, oh, he can't eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, right? Well, that is one of the commands, but notice he gives another statement, right? He says, you are free. That's the first thing he tells the man. You are free. So God, our freedom that he gives us is given to us by him for covenant. You're free. And notice the freedom he gives to eat from any of the trees, right? So our freedom is very vast. But notice it's not unlimited, right? Because then God says, except the tree of knowledge of good and evil. So you are free to eat from any tree you want to, except this one, right? So God gives human freedom because he knows that we need it to be able to participate in covenant so that we can fully live in his image, right? Be his image, really. And but yet it's not unlimited. I can't do whatever I want, right? There's a limit to human freedom, right? And notice, why does God put this limit, or why does God make us aware, or make the first man aware of this limit? He says, from that tree you shall not eat, because when you eat from it, you shall die, right? Don't do it. You're going to die, right? If you do it. So God doesn't limit our freedom because he's mean and there's no fun rules and there's, right? God limits our freedom to protect us, right, from death. And death here we could also apply to protect us from evil, to protect us from suffering, right? But as you know, the humans didn't listen, right? The humans didn't listen and they fell and they ate the fruit, right? And when they ate the fruit in Genesis 3, oh, this is 3:16. I don't know what that other one was. I'll have to put it in later. Here's what happens. So we see, I don't have the fall written here, but we know they fell. Eve takes some of the fruit. She's tempted by the serpent, and she takes the fruit. She eats it, and then she gives it to her husband, who also eats it. And then God shows up, right? And God's like, hey, well, first of all, they're hiding, right? They covered themselves, they're hiding. And God's like, hey, where are you, right? and they're like, oh, we're naked, so we're hiding, right? And he's like, well, you obviously ate from the tree that I said don't eat from, right? And then we see in Genesis 3:16 through 17, when God reveals to them what the consequences of their free choice is going to be, are really, it's not really an authentic use of their freedom. They really abuse their freedom by making this choice to disobey God. So we see in Genesis 3:16 through 17, the consequences laid out. So to the woman, God says, I will intensify your toil in childbearing. In pain you shall bring forth children. Yet your urge shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you. To the man he said, because you listened to your wife and ate from the tree about which I commanded you, you shall not eat from it. Cursed is the ground because of you. In toil you shall eat its yield all the days of your life. Thorns and thistles it shall bear for you, and you shall eat the grass of the field. By the sweat of your brow you shall eat bread, until you return to the ground from which you were taken, for you are dust, and to dust you shall return. Now we could break these down and we could go through each one. We'd say, look, this is kind of like where this consequence of sin, this is where this suffering comes from. We're not going to do that. What's important here is to notice that the consequence of their abuse of their freedom was applied to them both. So all of humanity, right? The man and the woman, so all of humanity. And notice also that it's multifaceted, right? And it ends in death. It's suffering. Each one is going to experience suffering in their own unique way, right? And it's going to end in death. But also notice that it says, thorns and thistles it shall bear for you. Even creation, there's a rupture even in creation itself, right? All is changed. Suffering is brought forth into the world, right? Through their sin. That's how it entered, right? So, but how did it reach us, right? So through the original sin, suffering enters the world, right? It's because they turned from God. They essentially decided to get out of the covenant with God, right? They chose themselves over God. That's how it entered in. But then the Catechism of the Catholic Church in paragraph 404 asks this beautiful question, right? How did the sin of Adam, right, that first sin of the first humans, how did that become the sin of all of his descendants, which would be all of us, right? How did that happen? I'm just going to read this part because it's really interesting. It's really beautiful the way that the church articulates it in the Catechism. It says, the whole human race is in Adam, right? So we're all descended from our first parents as one body of one man. By this unity of the human race, all men are implicated in Adam's sin, as all are implicated in Christ's justice. Still, the transmission of original sin is a mystery that we cannot fully understand. But we do know by revelation that Adam had received original holiness and justice, not for himself alone, but for all human nature, right? So we have a nature. What is it? I'm creating God's image. I have free will, I have intellect, I have self-consciousness, and I'm created to be in covenant with others. That's my nature. Well, guess what? When Adam received all he received from God, his nature, his original state of holiness, right? He received that for all of us. But then by yielding to the tempter, the Catechism says, Adam and Eve committed a personal sin. So it was their personal sin. It was their fault. It wasn't our fault, right? But this sin affected the human nature that they would then transmit in a fallen state. It is a sin which will be transmitted by propagation to all mankind. That means by heredity. That is, by the transmission of a human nature deprived of original holiness and justice. And that is why original sin is called a sin, only in an analogical sense. So that means like an analogy. It is a sin contracted, not committed, a state, not an act, right? So, and I think the Lewis reading is going to illustrate this so beautifully, this idea of going from our original, how God originally intended humanity with our first parents, to what sin did to our state of being, right? And then suffering enters the world through this, right? Through this fallen state. So humans are given a particular nature by God that could have been free of sin, free of suffering, free, right? But because of the abuse of their freedom, now Adam and Eve's personal sin, right, has affected all of our natures, all of humanity. So then in paragraph 1607 in the Catechism, it says, according to faith, the disorder we notice so painfully does not stem from the nature of man and woman, nor from the nature of their relations, but from sin. As a break with God, the first sin had for its first consequence the rupture of the original communion between man and woman. Their relations were distorted by mutual recriminations. Their mutual attraction, the Creator's own gift, changed into a relationship of domination and lust, and the beautiful vocation of man and woman to be fruitful, multiply, and subdue the earth was burdened by the pain of childbirth and the toil of work. Right? So we see, I wanted to bring this out because this, in the Catechism, paragraph 1607, is directly placed under the sacrament of marriage. But I wanted to bring it out here and apply it to all of us in our relationships, no matter if they're marital or not, because the same rings true. What was once a freedom to trust the other, to give ourselves to each other as gifts, to be in communion with the other, that is now distorted, right? And it's our relationships now with one another. If you like take yourself outside the marital context, right, and you just think about like your last fight with a person who's not your spouse, right? You know there was some domination going on there, right? Somebody was trying to win. That's usually why people fight, because we want to win, right? So we see that like this state that we have now inherited, by the way, it's called concupiscence, now brings forth into our world, into our relationships, no matter if they're marital or not, brings forth now suffering, the way we treat each other. We are fallen, and then then we affect the world, and the world becomes fallen, right? All right, so all of this has been leading us up to talk about the source of evil, right? And this is what the church teaches about what is the source. The church says the source of evil and suffering is sin. It might not even be your own personal sin, right? So I'll give you an example from my own life. My husband and I, his name is Duffy. Duffy and I are not able to have children. And we looked at all our options, and we tried. We were older when we got married. We're 36, and so we were kind of at the cutoff age that most adoption agencies allow adoption. And we went to foster parent classes, and we just couldn't make any of those options work in this kind of what we felt was a short window. So we made the decision to remain childless, unless God, of course, would miraculously, like Sarah and Abraham, give us a child. But we, for us, right? So think about, so like whenever I'm explaining this, especially to my students, right? So I'll say like, why? Okay, so we're doing what we're supposed to do. We're following the church's teachings. We're, you know, et cetera, et cetera. Why are we being left childless? Like, that doesn't seem fair. It doesn't seem like, you know, that's a good thing that God is allowing, right? Et cetera, et cetera. We've been through all of that, right? All that grief. But the truth is, it's because of sin, right? Why? And my husband's the one that, and he doesn't mind me, I asked him, he doesn't mind me sharing the story. My husband's actually the one that can't have children. And so why is it? Why is his biology broken like that, right? Why can't, right? Well, it's because of sin. Now, not because of some personal sin that Duffy did. Duffy didn't like cause his own, you know, situation, but it's because of sin, period, right? Not our personal sin, but it's because there's sin in the world. It's because there's suffering and evil in the world, because we are all sinful, because our bodies, even our bodies, our souls and our bodies, our whole persons, for all of humanity, for all of time, has been affected by sin. We're what is called fallen, right? Now, what's going to matter, and what we'll start to talk about next week, we're in this state, right, of being now. We're in this state. And what's going to matter is what we do with it, right? What do we do with it? But we're not there yet. First, let's look at C.S. Lewis's reading from The Problem of Pain and his take on the fall of man. And just a disclaimer, C.S. Lewis, famous lay theologian, he though was Anglican, but have no fear, I actually got this reading excerpt from, or the book, I read the whole book, but I took this excerpt from a book assigned by a seminary professor. So C.S. Lewis is often studied in Catholic seminaries everywhere. He's brilliant, lovely, awesome, wonderful insights. And but we want to take, I want to make a clarification. So he's going to propose in something we're going to read. He's going to propose, like, I think he has this little thing where he says, no telling how many of these creatures God made, right? That may or may not be true, as far as like how many creatures may have been suitable to become human at the time. But the church, the Catholic Church, holds to, there were two, you know, there's an original first parents, a man and one woman. So I just want to like make that, because, you know, in reading this, right, but Lewis is not of our faith tradition, so I just want to point that out, that but it's really beautiful to read, and the way he is, he's very poetic. So here we go. So Lewis takes us from the creation, like when, and he has a perspective on like evolution. And just to say another word, I'm just thinking of this as I start to read it. Lewis is going to talk about it from a perspective, like sometimes people ask the question, like, can we believe in evolution? And because you have like two different opposite poles there, right? You have like people that say, no, it happened exactly the way it happened in the Bible. Then you have the other extreme, God wasn't involved at all, and we just arose from apes, right? So you have like kind of two poles, extremes there. But the church, very beautifully, takes kind of a middle road. And so the church would basically say, like, is evolution possible? Yeah, humans could have evolved from a lower life form. That's possible, but not without God, right? God is the one who, in a separate creative act, made the human soul. Now, whether God made that human soul after a creature had evolved, like Lewis is going to explain it to us, had evolved to a certain point that could receive the image of God, and then God, in a separate creative act, made a human soul, quite possible, right? No conflict there. Faith in science, if that's what science is going to prove, great. But the church says that's up to science to prove, right? What we are obligated to believe, right, was that God created the human soul in a separate creative act, right? That was all God. And made the creature, the human, in his image. That's what that's what we're obligated to believe in our faith. So could you say, like, well, God did everything exactly the way it happened, but you could believe that and be okay, right? That's cool. But what you cannot do is you cannot say that humans came about and God had no part in it, right? God had a very specific part. He created the human soul. Okay, so here we go with Lewis, this little excerpt from Lewis. So he starts off, for long centuries, God perfected the animal form, which was to become the vehicle of humanity and the image of himself. He gave it hands whose thumb could be applied to each of the fingers, and jaws and teeth and throat capable of articulation, and a brain sufficiently complex to execute all the material motions whereby rational thought is incarnated. The creature may have existed for ages in this state before it became man. It may even have been clever enough to make things which a modern archaeologist would accept as proof of its humanity. But it was only an animal, because all its physical and psychical, sorry, can't say it, processes were directed to purely material and natural ends. Then, in the fullness of time, God caused to descend upon this organism, both on its psychology and physiology, a new kind of consciousness that could say I and me, which could look upon itself as an object which knew God, which could make judgments of truth, beauty, and goodness, and which was so far above time, it could perceive time flowing past. And then in the next column, where the bracket is with the little star, his organic processes obeyed the law of his own will, not the law of nature. His organs sent up appetites to the judgment seat of will, not because they had to, because he chose. Sleep meant to him not the stupor which we undergo, but willed in conscious repose. Now this is debatable, right? He remained awake to enjoy the pleasure and duty of sleep. And then we're going to skip down to the next little bracket with this star at the very bottom of the page. The new consciousness had been made to repose on its creator, and repose it did. However rich and varied man's experience of his fellows or fellow in charity, in friendship and sexual love, or of the beast or of the surrounding world, then first recognized as beautiful and awful, God came first in his love and in his thought. So in other words, everything that man was in his consciousness, he directed himself totally to God. God came first for the man in all things. And without, the next thing Lewis says, and that without painful effort. And it was no problem for the man to direct himself totally to God. And then we're going to go down to, or we're going to go now to the next page, the next column, where the star is by the bracket. And this is the part that I said, this is Lewis kind of projecting, right? This is not what the church teaches. We do not know how many of these creatures God made, nor how long they continued in the paradisal state. So paradisal means like the man of paradise. But sooner or later they fell. Someone or something whispered that they could become as gods, that they could cease directing their lives to their creator and taking all their delights as uncovenanted mercies, as accidents, which arose in the course of a life directed, not to those delights, but to the adoration of God. So what he's saying here, right? He's saying maybe they thought that they could take all these gifts God gave them and keep them, right? That they weren't part of the covenant that they had with God. Maybe this is what they were thinking. So uncovenanted mercies, right? So that they weren't part, that they could be what they were, even if they wanted to like get out of the covenant. As a young man wants a regular allowance from his father, which he can count as his own, within which he makes his own plans, so they desire to be on their own, to take care for their own future, to plan for pleasure and for security, but which nevertheless was theirs, not his. They wanted, as we say, to call their souls their own. But that means to live a lie, for our souls are not in fact our own. They wanted some corner in the universe, of which they could say to God, this is our business, not yours. but there is no such corner. And then we're going to go to the next page. And at the bottom there, it said, for all I can see, it may, and he's talking about the sin now, right? What sin did they commit? For all I can see, it might have concerned the literal eating of a fruit, but the question is of no consequence. So what they actually did, we're not sure, right? But this act of self-will on the part of the creature, which constitutes an utter falseness to its true creaturely position, is the only sin that can be conceived as the fall. For the difficulty about the first sin is that it must be very heinous, or its consequence would not be so terrible, and yet it must be something which a being free from the temptations of fallen man, so they didn't have the same temptations we did, could conceivably have committed. The turning from God to self fulfills both conditions. So in other words, Lewis is saying here, they turned to them. They chose themselves rather than choosing God. It was self-idolatry. They wanted to be their own gods, right? So then we're going to go up to the next page, the next column, I should say, and we're going to go to the second paragraph where it's underlined. It doubtless expected, so the man, the person, doubtless expected that it would retain this control when it had ceased to obey God. So in other words, they thought they could do whatever they wanted and retain their dominion over themselves, their dominion over creation, right? But its authority over the organism was delegated authority, which it lost when it ceased to be God's delegate. But God was allowing them to participate, right, in something that he was giving them. And then when they chose themselves, they lost it, right? And then we're going to go down to where it says he. So just go down the paragraph a few. He began to rule the organism in a more external way, not by laws of spirit, but by those of nature. Thus, the organs no longer governed by man's will fell under control of ordinary biochemical laws and suffered whatever the interworkings of those laws might bring about in the way of pain, senility, and death. And desires began to come up into the mind of the man, not as his reason chose, but just as the biochemical environmental facts happen to cause them. And then we're going to go down to the next underline. The will, caught in a tidal wave of mere nature, had no resource but to force back some of the new thoughts and desires. And these uneasy rebels became the subconscious as we. Now, this is also debatable. Do we have a subconscious before we fell? Maybe, but Lewis paints a very vivid picture here. Evil things started to come up from the lower parts of man and try to take over his reason, right? He's all of a sudden found himself at war within himself, right? And then where the box is, right? He says, it was a loss of status as a species. That is big. A loss as a status as a species. And this is the proof he gives, the next line. What man lost by the fall was his original specific nature. Dust thou art, and unto dust shalt thou return. The total organism which had been taken up into his spiritual life was allowed to fall back into the merely natural condition that had been raised, and then it fell, right? And then over on the next column, it says, it was the emergence of a new kind of man in the box. A new species, never made by God, had sent itself into existence. The change which man had undergone was not parallel to the development of a new habit. It was a radical alteration of his constitution, a disturbance of the relation between his component parts, and an internal perversion of one of them. Okay, so the fall is what caused this rupture within ourselves, right? And brought about in man this new state, this new reality that is now, as the Catechism says, handed down to us over forever, right? Forever. It's handed down to us. And this fallenness, this state of fallenness, really is what we experience as suffering. We experience the consequences of Adam and Eve's first sin, not because we're personally guilty, but because we've inherited now this war within ourselves called concupiscence, this horrible way that we relate to each other in the rupture of communion, right? And even a rupture with creation and our dominion over it.